Bonjour, Dietmar.
Bonjour.
Ladies and gentlemen, good morning, and thank you very much for being with us this morning, either in this room at IFRI or far away abroad. And my first idea will be to give the floor to Dietmar Schweizgut from Vienna. And in Vienna, Dietmar Schweizgut is Secretary General of the Austro-French, I'm sorry, I'm accustomed to say that in French, Austro-French Center for Rapprochement in Europe. Dietmar, vous avez la parole. You have the floor.
Good morning from Vienna to all of you, and I would wish to be in person at this important conference, which is held at IFRI, the French Institute for International Relations. And I'm sure all the participants do look forward to an interesting discussion on a topic, I think, which has been on our minds for quite a long time, namely the European strategic economy in terms of the green transition, but also in terms of the digital transition to a new economy. The war in Ukraine has changed many things, and we are mostly talking about the defense and security aspects, but it has also painfully made clear that the path to this transition to a green and more digital economy, which we thought could be based at least on a transition phase with fossil fuels, which to a large extent come from Russia in terms of Europe's dependence, could last for a bit longer. Now, we all know that apart from the fact that the aggression of Russia in Ukraine has shattered the security architecture in Europe as we knew it after the Cold War, it also fundamentally changed the transition which we knew would have to happen anyway. Now, this is not something which is particularly linked only to Russia. We are talking about energy here, but I think what we are discussing today has also been placed in a larger context, namely, to what extent is Europe dependent on critical materials, on supply chains which become increasingly vulnerable, on a rules-based international economic order, which was the basis of a model of globalization from which Europe has benefited. To what extent has the war in Ukraine also accentuated the American-Chinese rivalry, which increasingly is playing out in the field of technology with a huge impact on Europe? All this, I think, have to lead to a rethink of industrial and technological policy in Europe. They also have to be reconciled with differing views on competition policy, on the division of labor and competences between the European Union and its member states. And I think we are talking here about crucial aspects for the future of Europe. And that is, I think, much more at the core of what we think usually when we talk about European strategic autonomy than the mere defense and security aspects, which I think have changed anyway with the war in Ukraine and have shifted, at least for the time being, to NATO. Thank you very much, Dominique. You are also the president of the Centre Franco-Autrichien pour le Rapprochement in Europe. I thank you for organizing this at IFRI, and I'm looking forward to an interesting discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dietmar, for this opening. Mesdames et messieurs, you know that European strategic autonomy is a beloved concept in France. It has been firstly defined mainly in the diplomatic and defense and security field, but it has received now a more broader definition in our strategic context. As Dietmar has mentioned, the strategic context is defined by several factors, mainly, of course, climate change, US-China, you mentioned US-China rivalry, global technological race, and of course, last but not least, the situation created by war in Ukraine. This war has showed clearly our dependencies, our vulnerabilities, and maybe threatened already the agenda or the beginning of an agenda for strategic autonomy, which have been developed mainly as an inheritance of the COVID crisis. So our basic interrogation this morning will be, first, is it possible in this present situation to maintain a coherent agenda for strategic autonomy? Will this agenda be compatible with this green transition you mentioned, Dietmar, and with which means and partners? So this is a big program for the presentations, your questions, and all the discussion. I thank Mario Olsner, who is the director of the Vienna Institute for International Economic Studies and who is, by the way, co-organizer with our center and IFRI of this session to be here. I thank Alice Panier, who is the head of the IFRI program, Geopolitics of Technologies. And I have, unfortunately, to mention that Desiree Ruckert, who was the third man, I should say, this morning, has been forbidden to participate to this session for a very private and important reason. So we wish her recovery and to her son a rapid recovery. So my introduction is over. I hope it was enough short. And I'll give the floor first to Alice Panier and then to Mario. Alice, you have the floor. Merci encore.
Merci, Dominique. Bonjour, good morning to everyone. So I was asked it's a huge topic that we're dealing with today. It has many ramifications, many aspects to it. And I was asked to tackle three questions, which already in themselves are pretty big, which is the effect of the war in Ukraine on Europe's search for technological sovereignty, the critical vulnerabilities that the EU is facing, especially and including the supply of material for high technology development. And finally, what strategies should be implemented to limit the growth of new vulnerabilities? So three big topics. I'm going to try to not be too long. And obviously, we'll start with the context. And it was already mentioned by Mr. Schweizgut as well, that the Ukraine war has highlighted the effects of Europe's dependencies in many areas. Obviously, Russian gas has been mentioned, but also in raw materials, to the extent that Russia is an important producer of various metals, including aluminum, nickel, copper, palladium, titanium. But Ukraine also supplies various raw materials that are critical to chip manufacturing. Ukrainian supplies as well are impacted by the war, obviously. But also other dependencies in things like software. We see that the role of private software companies like Microsoft are playing a significant part in helping Ukraine in its cyber defense. On the other hand, Russian software suppliers such as Kaspersky have been sort of either forbidden or avoided as a result of the war. We also see Europe's dependencies on obviously Russian space launchers and space rockets, and also Europe's dependencies in terms of satellite connectivity, as we've seen the role of Starlink in Ukraine. At the same time, the sanctions against Russia have reinforced certain links, bilateral links, and at the same time led to greater separation of technology ecosystems. We've seen greater Russian dependencies on China on the one hand, and greater European dependencies on the US in energy and space, because indeed the dependency on Russian space launchers has been sort of replaced temporarily, at least by a dependency on US space launchers. And in energy as well, Russian gas has been somehow substituted by American provisions. At the same time, we see this move towards diversification towards other partners for supplies, including of raw materials, that Russia and Ukraine either are less providing or no longer providing. So we see companies activating alternative providers, but we also see governments politicizing the question of who supplies what. So I would say the Ukraine war has not led to greater European autonomy, but at the same time has reinforced the case for it, and especially the case for the green transition and digital sovereignty as two tools that would contribute to greater resiliency and less dependency of Europe on foreign suppliers. But at the same time, I think that other elements of the context matter just as much as the war in Ukraine to explain current attempts for European sovereignty, medium-term concerns about the new dependencies that will come with the green transition and the digital transition, which is a little bit paradoxical considering what I just said about how it will both enhance Europe's resiliency and autonomy, but at the same time create new dependencies. And I'll obviously elaborate on that. And in the short term, responding to the US and Chinese policies and their relationship. Because since a year ago, there's been other developments, obviously, with regards to Taiwan, export controls, the US IRA, etc. So this context being set, second question is, what are the critical vulnerabilities that the EU faces in its search for technological sovereignty, including materials? So a first point I want to make is that critical technologies, so-called critical technologies, well, we see that green technology and digital technology go hand in hand. First, because they both appear in the lists of the EU's critical technologies, which includes AI, robotics, semiconductors, cybersecurity, aerospace, defense, energy storage, quantum and nuclear technologies, as well as nanotechnologies and biotechnologies. So we see that they're considered to be critical in themselves, whether they are digital or green technologies, but also specifically digital technologies are enablers of other technologies. They are enablers of green technologies. So actually the EU has come up with this list of KETs, which in US means key emerging technologies, but in EU parlance means key enabling technologies. And these key enabling technologies are things like advanced manufacturing, AI, nanotechnologies, connectivity technologies. So the two transitions really go hand in hand from a technology perspective as well as a political one. The EU's dependencies in all those areas are pretty well identified at this point, so I won't expand on that. There's been countless reports published either by the EU itself or think tanks that look at Europe's vulnerabilities and dependencies, whether in green or digital technologies, especially since 2020. And we've identified the EU's dependencies all along, and also its strengths, obviously, because it has some, obviously, but those vulnerabilities identified all along the value chain, from R&D investment to commercialization of technology, to production and manufacturing, to raw materials, to software, to data. We know already those dependencies. So I'm just going to zoom in quickly on critical materials, even though that's not something I'm particularly specialized in. I would actually recommend to check the work of my colleagues in the energy team here, as well as in the Asia Center, who have produced work on those critical materials in particular. So obviously, again, linking back the green and digital technologies, critical raw materials are used in both green and digital technologies, semiconductors, screens, optical fibers, wind turbines, electric vehicle motors, etc. So considering both transitions that are going on, digital and green, it's estimated that that there is a need for 500% growth in production of critical raw materials by 2030. So that's less than a decade estimated need for 500% growth. And just the semiconductor market in itself will grow by 50% over the next 10 years, according to the EU. So vulnerabilities when it comes to critical raw materials are of two kinds. The first is the concentration of production, and the second one is different types of political barriers to access. Concentration of production is something that is also very well documented. We know that China produces is very dominant in certain with certain minerals, including the most famous about rare earth, which the EU considers rare earth to be the one facing the highest supply risk in a recent study, especially for permanent magnets that are used in renewables and electric vehicles. And among the G7 countries, only Canada and the US produce more than 10% of given critical raw materials, including rare earths. All the other producers are non-G7 countries, and especially China for rare earth elements. So there is concentration of production. 80% of global production is concentrated among 3 countries. But there are also political barriers to access, whether it's trade restrictions, including quotas or export controls, or coercion practices that can limit access. So in this context, what strategies should be implemented to limit the growth of new vulnerabilities? Well, I haven't invented anything. The EU is coming up with its own Critical Raw Materials Act, actually within a couple of weeks. So I'm going to talk a little bit about this, but in a broader context, again, of high-tech dependencies. I think there should be, and there is de facto, a fourfold approach. The first aspect is awareness about vulnerabilities, and including awareness about supply chain vulnerabilities. I was saying that those dependencies are already pretty well identified. They are in general terms, but it seems that even though there's been work going on for the past 2 or 3 years, governments still have difficulty accessing information from the private sector about their own value chains. So governments have set up monitoring systems since 2020, whether it's the US developing an AI tool to monitor critical raw material sources. The UK has just set up a few months ago a critical mineral intelligence center within its Department for Business and Economy and Industry. France has set up the OFREMI, Observatoire des ressources minérales pour les filières industrielles. And there is also a cooperative approach that's growing with EU, US working through the TTC, the Trade and Technology Council, to work on an early warning mechanism and on chips in particular, and as well on chips as well. The US is leading this Chip 4 initiative with chip producers, 4 chip producing countries, to try and share information about value chain risks. But more information is still needed to come from the private sector. At least that's what Thierry Breton recently complained about. Also, we can wonder what's the compatibility between like all those initiatives for sharing information, whether what the US is doing with India, Japan, and what the US is doing with the EU, whether that can go hand in hand, whether they can share similar types of information. How broadly can you share the information? So that's the first question, like awareness is still an issue. The second aspect of the strategy is obviously producing in Europe. So that's something, one of the key aspects that's going to come up with Thierry Breton's new, what at least Thierry Breton outlined would be in the new Critical Raw Materials Act. That's going to cover, identifying strategic resources, constituting stocks, setting up high standards for both imported and EU-produced critical raw materials, but also using tools like those that have been used for the CHIPS Act, that is to say, relaxing state aid rules to increase local investment in Europe to both extract and refine, but also recycle. And I'll come back to that in a moment. Refining indeed is probably a good area for, because there's probably more. It's not necessarily the same countries that have the raw materials and those that refine them, and there is a possibility to at least diversify part of that. The third aspect of the strategy, so after awareness and producing, is diversification. So that links to what I was just saying. There are known potential reserves for at least critical raw materials in other countries, including countries that our governments currently probably would be more comfortable working with than, say, with China. So there are reserves in Brazil, Vietnam, Australia, Morocco, within the EU itself, as well as in North America. So there are opportunities to exploit those reserves and diversify. Yeah, I won't expand on that. But this also goes with a broader question of to what extent, again, are we politicizing supply chains? And there is this whole debate that we can have then perhaps in the Q&A about like-minded countries and friendshoring and all of that. And I think that's something that the other speaker will address a bit more. And finally, fourth element of the strategy is thinking in long term. So I think we just started today talking about Ukraine. So obviously we're very much in like short-term considerations and like short-term lessons. But there is a necessity, and de facto that's already the case, that all those dependencies are being addressed with a long-term mindset. Even if we consider semiconductors, there was this crisis starting in 2020 with COVID, a supply crisis, and what the EU came up with, the CHIPS Act, was how to build the long-term industrial strategy for the EU in chips, including leading-edge chips that the EU currently does not produce and will probably only be able to produce within 10 years. And with huge investment in R&D, innovation, etc. So we're already de facto in this long-term strategy. The focus as well is on low energy consumption chips for quantum computers. So we're really very much focused on leading edge and innovative approaches. And in the same fashion, I think for critical raw materials, it's going to be about investing in research and innovation for recycling of materials, which is currently difficult, expensive, and energy consuming. And we see that the EU, the UK, the US have launched calls for funding research and innovation in recycling critical raw materials, and also obviously researching new materials and innovations in materials themselves. So it's easy to just consider short-term, if you like, compensations for those risks or supply chain crisis. But we can't think without this long-term approach. I think that's the first way to think, but then that requires a little bit of patience. But what I find interesting, for example, is in certain emerging technologies like quantum, we see that the EU and the actors of the quantum ecosystem in Europe are already thinking about the potential supply chain risks that will come with those technologies and identifying from very early on what is the types of materials and components that are needed to develop those technologies and how to make sure that the EU has non-dependency, to use the DG Defis language, non-dependency along the value chain for those emerging technologies. So I'll stop here. Thank you for listening. I look forward to the discussion.
Merci beaucoup, Alice. Thank you very much. And I give immediately the floor to Mario.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for the invitation. I would maybe just start with a few studies that we have been conducting more recently and then observations made these days. We have published together with the Bertelsmann Stiftung a study called Keeping Friends Closer, and we have launched it at the Munich Security Conference recently. The idea is to look at what are the geoeconomic interdependencies in the EU neighborhood. So we are speaking about the southern neighborhood in North Africa and Middle East. We are speaking about the Western Balkans and Turkey, those who are already in a system of application to become members of the Union in one way or another. And the eastern neighborhood, so Belarus, Ukraine, Moldova on the one hand, and on the other hand, the Southern Caucasus republics. And we have been going through a number of indicators, and we also looked at, well, what is in a way the influence of the EU, but also what is the influence of peers and rivals, so US, China, Russia. And we went through different chapters, trade, for instance. Here, I would say the EU is really the only game in town in almost all of these neighboring countries. There are a few exceptions, Russia and China, maybe in some of the Southern Caucasus republics. the US maybe in 2 or 3 of the countries of the southern neighborhood. But otherwise, it's really by a large margin the EU that in terms of trade is really the bloc with which these countries cooperate. It's similar in finance issues, looking at foreign direct investment, for instance, or banking, or if we look at the share of currencies in the local central banks' reserves, there it is also an issue, obviously, of the US dollar. So the combined West is here dominant, and this also hints at that we are not alone. It's important to also think about other democracies active in the region. We looked at technology and knowledge exchange. There things already look a little bit different. It's still the case that, for instance, in terms of ICT services trade, the EU is very important in all of these countries, more important than others. But for instance, if you look at high-tech manufacturing trade, the EU used to be very important. But over the last decade or so, we see that China's impact is much, much stronger, and the dynamics in this area playing against the EU. This also hints, obviously, at the problems that our own high-tech sector is problematic, that we lack in a way on a global level certain forms of industries which others really have developed much stronger than ourselves. Similarly, in infrastructure, the EU is still very important, but we see that China is becoming more and more important. For instance, if we think about the Western Balkans, there they have really stepped up quite a lot, and this relates to partly ownership in certain critical infrastructure, but also in terms of financing new infrastructure. And finally, we also looked at labor mobility, which I think is something that is really going to be one of the key issues over the coming decades. So far, a lot of labor migration from those neighboring countries came from the Western Balkans, Turkey, Eastern Partnership. But here, the population projections for the next decades are going south. So partly the population in the working age is really shrinking. And there will be a great shift to the southern neighborhood countries, where we still see for the coming decades that the projections foresee a growing population, a working age population. So this all hints at the fact that we need to ideally not react, but have some kind of a plan for the coming decades. I don't know how realistic this really is, but it would be good. It would be good to have probably more of a partnership approach with our neighbors, looking, for instance, also particularly at this migration topic. The idea is also to maybe do a bit more about the carrots, but maybe also about the sticks. It's not nice to say, but we really have not used this leverage that as a European Union we have in our neighborhood. If we look at other rivals, they have been making much more out of their cards that they have in the hand, which are typically not better than ours necessarily. So we need to make sure that certain political goals are in line maybe with ours as well. But on the other hand, the carrots, we haven't been doing enough with that as well. Yeah. Thinking about such a small territory like the Western Balkans, with a collective GDP that is comparable to that of half of Greece or the Slovak Republic, so which is really a quantité négligeable. We have transfers on an annual basis in the pre-accession funds, which in terms of these tiny economies, GDP is something like 1% per annum. Yeah? And this is nothing really. This is not an important measure. It's important for those countries, but if we look at the eastern members of the European Union, they receive 2, 3, 4, in some years, maybe up to 5%. Hungary is, by the way, very skillful in making most out of EU transfers. So that is a different level, and I think that is the level that really can make a difference in terms, particularly of infrastructure investment. And there is also the question, if we can't prove that we are able to make a difference in the group of accession countries, then I think we shouldn't even try with the others. And in that sense, I think we made a lot of mistakes in the Western Balkans. There is basically no progress for decades. Some countries really are, North Macedonia is now for 20 years in the waiting room, and it's not their fault. It's to a large extent our fault. And these people are not really expecting anything anymore from the Union. I think we must make a change in our policies. And Serbia is really the key country in the Western Balkans. It's also the country where we see that, for instance, Russian and Chinese influence in Europe is strong. Russia in the energy sector, China in the infrastructure sector, and they are able to also connect this with political issues. Serbia is the prime partner of China in Europe. They have had joint police special forces exercises. What is coming next? Do we want to wait for any further steps in this direction, or do we want to make really a substantial offer to the region that is, however, also connected with a certain political alignment to our own goals? So I think these are some of the issues raised in this study. And that brings us also to the question of how do we cooperate with like-minded democracies in the world to achieve our own goals. And I think we can do it better. I've been involved in a series of studies for the EU delegation in Tokyo. There is a European, an EU-Japan strategic partnership agreement. It's time to bring life into these things, to be active. So the first step was to identify possible projects that EU and Japan could cooperate on in, for instance, these regions, but also further in Central Asia, in the Indo-Pacific, which obviously for China, for Japan is more of an interest. And here China is always the elephant in the room, obviously, with the Belt and Road Initiative. The EU has now the Global Gateway Initiative. There are similar initiatives that Japan also have. Again, I think not enough money, not enough fresh money, but joining forces with others could be one way to go forward. And we identified a number of common projects where at least a parallel financing could be maybe arranged. But also talking to our Japanese colleagues and people there, also from the administration and so on, it became clear that they are still hesitant a little bit. They don't really understand, I think, what we as a European Union are. We probably often don't understand it ourselves. It will be necessary to, I think, communicate much better with our partners. I think, for instance, the EU delegation in Tokyo would need much more staff to really be in constant talks with their counterparts in the national administrations. Obviously, having a supranational identity on the one side and a national one on the other side, that is a problem, not only within Europe, but also with our partners in the world. This leads me to our prime partner, the US. I've been yesterday and the day before yesterday in Brussels at the CEPS Ideas Forum, talking to people from the Commission, from think tankers, from academia, businesses, journalists, and that was the main topic. Basically, the US is stepping up with the IRA. I don't know who came up with that abbreviation anyway. The Inflation Reduction Act, where they have a clear aim based on the possibilities that the US administration has, and that is basically tax breaks, connected with the need to source from the US, respectively North America, when it comes to green, clean technology investments and production in the US. And what would be the EU answer to that? On the one hand, I think we have to be happy that there is finally a US administration that sees also not only the digital transition, but also the green transition as something important. But on the other hand, obviously, there is the question, well, if there is a Buy American clause in the US policy of, let's say, green industrial policy, well, what will we do? Alice mentioned there is the Raw Materials Act being prepared. There was a suggestion by the Commission about what would be the answer, EU's answer to the US IRA. I think there have been several good ideas. The Solidarity Fund, which I think is very important, but the question is how realistic is that? That could help to finance actually green industrial policy in the EU, because the idea to go also via tax breaks is problematic. I think this is acknowledged. It is on the table as well, but it is clear that that is a problem, because that will mean that basically only Germany and France will be really able to even more centralize industrial policy on this continent. And if we would have a separate fund which would try to also spread new industry in particularly green technology all across the Union, I think that would be something that would help to make this whole endeavor of twin transition also more sustainable in a democratic way. Because generally we see, I think already since the global financial crisis, that there is an ongoing shift basically a paradigm shift going on, particularly younger generations of researchers, of policymakers everywhere, in international organizations, in the Commission, in academia, with their experiences, question the hegemony of the idea of efficiency that was so far for the last decades the guiding principle in all our particularly single market industrial policy or non-industrial policy, and acknowledging that there is a trade-off between efficiency and security. I think security in the broadest possible way we could define it. Obviously, it's all the way to military security, energy security, which is very much related, but it goes on to, I think, social security. I think the social pillar is an important development in the Union, and I think that is also something we might want to export to our partners in the world. And many other issues of security, I would call it also some sort of populism security should be here an issue. And in this respect, I would kind of remind ourselves that the time when the UK was part of the single market, in general, the UK was a very dynamic economy. It indeed created, being part of this big market, a very high-skilled labor force. There was employment growth in high-skill stratas of the British economy. However, given that Britain itself is not a welfare state compared to the continental European welfare states, these forces of agglomeration that are at work in our common market were not challenged by any either federal structure or social transfer structure or empowerment structures in the UK. And hence all these great new jobs were created in London and Southern England. Yeah? And Northern England and Eastern England lost completely out, and they had really a bad time. And well, we all know where the Brexit votes were. They were in north and the east of England. And neglecting this social security compared to the efficiency of the market, in the end, reduced the size of our market, and we all lost. So I think these lessons, I think, partly have been learned, and I think we should take it from there and really have a new approach to industrial policy that deals with the digital transformation, the green transformation, but at the same time that is sustainable also in a social and political way. So thanks.
Thank you very much, Mario. Now it's time, ladies and gentlemen, for our discussion. You have the possibility to ask the question to our speakers. I will open the discussion, but only with two political questions. I let the economic and technical question to room. My first question is very simple. In which measure differences or possible divergences between member states of the European Union could have an effect on the official transition agendas? I could mention, for example, differences or divergences in defense options in the future, or present divergences on nuclear dimension or on migration. With the negotiation, the very difficult negotiation of the European Pact. That would be my first question. And my second question concerning the Western Balkans. I know that Austrians, French also, but Austrians are very interested in relations with Western Balkan countries. Do you think that the Ukrainian events will have an effect of accelerating the integration of those countries of Western Balkans, and with which effect on the points we discussed this morning? Positive or negative possible effects? But please don't respond to my questions. They are very open, and I am asking for the raising hands in this room. Not yet. No rising young. Bon. Alors, so please begin with me, my questions. As you like it.
I can say something about the Western Balkans if you want. But also about your first question, it's connected actually. I would say that the Second Austrian Republic has really only currently at least, only two common themes that are not contested within the political sphere. The one thing is to be against nuclear power, and the other thing is to be for the Western Balkans to join the Union. Yes, I don't really see a lot of other topics. That there are the other Austrians here, so and maybe I forgot something, but I think that's basically it. You know, so there are just these two things that hold together that republic, I think, in a way, and both are again connected to some sort of at least perceived security issues. but which make it also with regard to migration a very difficult topic on the EU agendas, with different nation states having perceived different payoff schemes. I would add to that the problem with international trade agreements. Speaking about the Mercosur agreement with our partners in Latin America, which I think we should have already done a long time ago, but it's now again time to speak about it. Again, Austria might be a problem case because the whole idea about trade agreements and the investment clauses have been discussed very critically, and maybe that's even a third topic where there is almost a unanimous view among political parties in the country. With regard to the Western Balkans, I think, I think, but I'm a bit, I also hope that indeed the whole issue of Ukraine, where the Union basically has promised Ukraine a membership, and I think as a Union we can't wait with Ukraine again 20 years as we did it with North Macedonia, that this will have a catalytic effect on the Western Balkans. It already partly had. So things are going on a little bit with the Kosovo-Serbia problem, with the accession status at least of several countries in the region. So I think in the end it will be a political decision to bring them into the Union, as it in the end always was. I mean, Bulgaria and Romania have been a political decision as well. Nobody will expect the Western Balkan countries to ever be like Switzerland. This will never happen. We can do whatever we want. They have a very different starting point already back in the Roman Empire. These were some of the poorest countries with all the problems that poor countries have. Corruption is, I think, a dependent variable. It's not like, otherwise it would be a racist argument. That would mean Balkan people are corrupt. Yeah? But no, I think it's a dependent variable in terms of economic development. And this area has, there are different theories why this area is poor. One is that there are mountains that directly go into the sea, and harbors at the sea don't have a good connection to agricultural areas in the back. So, I mean, whatever it is, this is in the center of Europe. We have to deal with it. And I think it's for us and for them better if we have them in the Union. And the idea that we reform the Union before any further accession, I'm sorry, but that is a French problem now. That is not correct. As Hedda Grabe mentioned yesterday in Brussels at this forum, the Union always had a reform of the Union after enlargements and not before. It's just not the way the Union works. So arguing that first the Union needs deepening and then enlargement is basically saying we don't want additional countries to join the Union.
But my question was, if this enlargement occurs, in fact, will it be positive, and that in which time for the questions we are discussing this morning? Well, enlargement is a political decision, okay, but after, what possibility will we have to go in this direction of a common agenda with so many members? This is the real question, and so many so different members, because you mentioned that Western Balkan countries were very different in economic level and political unity, etc.
Well, I mean, we have experience. I don't think really from, I mean, I'm not a game theorist, but whether you have 27 members or 37 members, I don't know whether that really makes a huge difference. You will always have one or two members, like it used to be the UK, maybe Denmark here, maybe this and that country. It depends on in which time. There are different governments that will probably have some kind of a special deal. But in the end, it always boils down to whether France and Germany really can work together well and find a solution where the majority of the countries can follow that. I think that's and then there we have seen problems more recently, or actually for quite a while already. Maybe more recently, actually things change a little bit in a better direction, with Germany also getting up from a very long dream, maybe, and then becoming more pragmatic.
So I just wanted to quickly go over your question about divergences among EU member states. I think when it comes to this sort of technological sovereignty of Europe, there are three sets of divergences. One is some EU member states, it's a matter of economic policy and political orientation about liberalism, or the role of the state in the economy. We see that Nordic countries are most of the time are happier with the free market, including if that means, in technology, just like in digital technology, just like in defense, acquiring American-made equipment, or as long as it's as we have a global free market, there is a bit more resistance in Nordic countries to having a strong hand to reindustrialize in the same fashion as we hear in France and more generally in the southern part of Europe. So they're usually Nordic partners are also a bit less comfortable with the concepts of sovereignty and strategic autonomy, including in the digital and technology, and not only in the military domain. Another set of divergences, I think, come from the fact that, just like in defense as well, we have different national economies, obviously, where the technology sector is more or less developed, and we have countries in, I guess, in the south and east of Europe, mostly, where high technology, digital technology is a smaller part of GDP than in western or north of Europe. And the third element, and that relates a little bit to my first point, is about what to do vis-a-vis the US. And so in response to the American Inflation Reduction Act, some EU member states are not necessarily super comfortable with coming up with a strong response against the US in the context, especially of the Ukraine war, where the US is providing so much support. So I think all of that is to be taken into account when considering why it is difficult to get all the EU member states on the same page for this technological sovereignty agenda. But I also wanted to react to something Mario said about the EU's external partnerships, and does the EU have a strategy, and what do our partners want from us, and what do they read from the EU's strategy or lack thereof? I think it's fair to say that the EU does not seem to have an foreign technology policy, the same way as the US has one that is quite forceful in pushing. China definitely has one. The EU still has a hard time integrating technology in all other aspects of its foreign policy, also tends to act on bilateral partnerships fashion, whereas it's maybe changing with the global gateway, but I think it relies still pretty much on bilateral versus the US, for example, trying to bring together countries around like groupings and minilaterals like the Quad or the CHIPS for. So the EU has a bit more difficulty with that. But we've actually just published last week a big report on the technology policies of digital middle powers that looks at 9 countries. And we see that for pretty much all the countries, the EU's position internationally when it comes to technology and how it positions itself vis-a-vis the US and China is quite attractive. Obviously normatively as in GDPR, but more generally as in an approach to the international system that is more amenable to having like multiple centers of power and multilateralism and multipolarity. And so many middle powers are interested in what the EU proposes in terms of vision, but does the EU sort of leverage that? I think not so much yet. And I think what we see also is that those middle powers are being courted by the EU, by the US, by China. That's sort of what you were saying about Eastern Europe pretty much happens all around the globe now, where whether it is to invest in mines, whether it is to relocate production of semiconductors, whether it is to, or not even semiconductors, but just generally manufacturing. So big powers are courting those middle powers, and middle powers also are doing things with one another. So so the EU is definitely not the only player there. And also what we see is that those middle powers don't necessarily just want to, say, manufacture things that are designed in the Western countries or to mine materials for Western technologies, but also want to develop their own ecosystems. And so the question of how much complementarity, so how much leverage does the EU have and how much complementarity do we have in the partnerships that we can build, or are we moving more towards like multiple duplications of for example, semiconductor value chains, as everyone is sort of investing in those. So these are sort of open questions, but there is definitely something to be still considered and probably articulated about the EU's external partnerships when it comes to technologies.
Thank you, Alice. Dietmar, do you have any comments?
Thank you very much, Dominique. I was very much interested by the comments of Alice, especially sort of linking her first and second interventions. On the first, where she talked also about the difficulty distinguishing between the short term and the long term and what it would imply in terms of investment, raises a bit the question if the European Union or Europe as such is really ready and willing to put the money and the energy behind all that. But the second point, when Ali said that there are obviously differences in views between the more so-called liberal Nordic or northern states in terms of trade and industrial policy and France and others, raises a bit the question when we talk about European autonomy or strategic autonomy in that field, can we really sort of aspire to sort of becoming a force as long as we still have sort of this division between national policies and policies at the EU level? I mean, we do have not only different views on what our policy should be as such, also linked basically to the more liberal outlook on competition policy, but we're also talking about the use of financial instruments and what policy should be funded at the EU level. And I was just wondering, also in terms of partnerships, Mario mentioned, for instance, cooperation with Japan, increasingly important, but are we really in a position to be a partner as long as we don't have a more unified view about what constitutes policy at the European level?
Well, that's the precondition. But I mean, the Commission is preparing now these suggestions how to move forward. Whether that will be accepted or not is something that the next few months will basically show. I mean, also maybe reacting to Alice's points about also the critical raw materials and so on. I mean, this in talking to people from the mining sector, in principle, most of these materials would be even available on European soil. But I mean, there is just probably no realistic way to really do all the mining. There are protected areas. The guy from the mining business said that in order to get all the paperwork done for a new mine, it takes between 7 and 10 years. I mean, this is nothing, this is almost prohibitive. That is maybe something where the Critical Raw Materials Act might help a little bit, but that's still in the end a national decision also. The fact is that we will remain dependent on not only China as the main mining and producing area of and refining area of all these important metals, but also even of Russia. The dependency on Russia will not go away. It's just the biggest territory on earth with just a lot of very important materials there. And the whole green transition is one that is connected with a lot of mining. It's about getting all kinds of strange metals out of earth. It's not maybe oil and gas, but it's yeah, all kinds of metals, and it's a very dirty, toxic business. And we have to be aware of that. Also, if we really think that in no time we will shift from combustion engine vehicles to e-vehicles, I think we should really rethink this and think maybe a hybrid solution and for a longer transition period might be a better way to go. And so, I mean, these policies, once we start at one point, we diffuse in all kinds of technological, strategic, economic areas. It represents the complexity of this whole thing. And then with national governments meddling into the whole game, it doesn't become easier. But I think still that there is now an understanding also among politicians as well as in the Commission to do something, that it is, we should have been doing something a long time ago, but let's do something now.
Alice.
Yes, just a brief comment about the money. That's kind of like the heart of the matter in many ways. And I think there was a recent study from the European Investment Bank that showed like 80% of European startups or unicorns. I can't remember if they were smaller or big already, but the 80% end up being acquired by foreign capital, and I'm talking European startups. So obviously that starts there because it starts with having European companies in given countries doing things, because we were mentioning mining. I don't know if rare earth mining in Sweden will develop after the recent find, but there are many stumbling blocks. But what I do think is that once you have a certain sector of activity within your country, then you want to make it thrive. And so then you will adhere more to this idea of sovereignty, autonomy, what have you. In areas where you don't have an industry, then that's where you will sort of be happy relying on foreign supplies. But that's like a very general idea. But I think also what I want to say is about dependencies on China and Russia. I kind of agree with you. I definitely don't think that there's going to be a full-on decoupling or divesting, not at all. That's not even happening from the US vis-a-vis China to such a large extent. So I think what we're talking about is more a de-risking strategy, which is the term that European institutions usually are using nowadays. De-risking strategy rather than decoupling. So it's again about like diversifying, having alternatives, and not having one single source for anything, pretty much. But yeah, that was my comment.
Thank you very much. You mentioned several times China and especially a Chinese presence in Serbia, which is evident, of course. Could you elaborate a little bit on the present developments and eventually and possibly future developments of Chinese strategy in Central Europe and Southern Europe? We know that the 16+1 process is quite over. But I suppose Chinese strategy is not over in Europe. Which ways are still open for this strategy now? Which characteristic, I should say?
Yeah, the quality changes a bit. That's true. The Belt and Road Initiative, definitely the 16+1 came to, in a way, an end. That end. Seems the Belt and Road Initiative lost a little bit of momentum, but we see, and that was loans for Chinese companies and Chinese workers, Chinese construction material being used to build a highway here, a rail connection there, and so on. What, for instance, in Serbia changed now, the level of foreign direct investment from China in principle is negligible, but last year was the first year when Chinese foreign direct investment in Serbia was higher than EU foreign direct investment. So the dynamics is changing. They enter, for instance, this market with firms and acquire capital ownership. So before it was just a credit, a loan for construction work that had to be paid back. And now it's, in a way, a stronger commitment. There is capital located in that country. And so that might be a first sign of a general shift in Chinese activities. But I mean, China in itself is dealing now a lot with its own problems. The real estate market is basically collapsing in a way. I mean, some of the main companies are basically bankrupt. There is now the discussions in the Chinese government who will follow as prime minister, what will be the overall economic policy. The idea that China had already quite some time was to move from export dependency, dependent on us basically as a market, to economic growth model that would be more centered around Chinese domestic growth, but that somehow failed so far. So the question really will be, what will be the decisions along this economic policy that China will have in the coming days and weeks, and yeah, then we probably have to take it from there and see how where the foreign element plays into their economic strategy.
Alice, a comment on Chinese strategy?
Not particularly at this moment.
Particularly. Ladies and gentlemen, any comment, more additional comment or remark? Monsieur, je vous en prie, press the button. No, not yet.
And I will try again. I think it works. Thank you very much for your intervention. I had a question slightly different to the topics that were raised, but I took the opportunity to have you. I don't have the chance to talk very often with Austrian researchers concerning more the running of the European Unions. And I have the feeling since approximately 1 year that in terms of negotiations, especially when there is a dispute between France and Germany, sometimes Germany used Austria as a kind of proxy to let some topics on the table and to avoid to raise a bone of contention between Berlin and Paris. I take, for example, that Austria took the lead in 2022 for filing in court the European taxonomy. And it appears like Berlin disagree about the nuclear points, but don't want to open an open fight in front of France and let Austria act as a proxy to defend its interests. So as an Austrian, I wanted just to have your feeling about that. Sorry for my frank question. But
No, I think it's a very good question. I think that would assume a level of coordination, which, I mean, I don't know whether that is really realistic. Yeah, but I mean, I really don't have the details about this. That would be probably on a very high level, some kind of. I think the nuclear issue is, as I mentioned before, really a probably deconstituent element of Austrian post-war politics. EU. And there have been local elections, quite a lot of them recently, in Lower Austria, which is the heartland of the Conservative Party's electorate, and they are in the government. If you would come up with something like nuclear is great, and that would be a complete change of all fundamental policies, and people in the border regions to Slovakia and Czech Republic, where actually the Slovak and Czech nuclear power plants are, which are considered not to be an extremely safe option of energy generation in Austria, because Austria has a tradition of having an extremely high share of hydropower, because it is in the Alps and there is a lot of water and so on. That's where you are. I think that you don't need any other foreign cooperation line to make Austrian foreign policy to be extremely active in this issue. And plus, the Green Party is also in the government. If the Green Party would not do something against nuclear power in Austria on also a European level, then they can forget about next elections. So, I mean, I think it doesn't need any coordination with others to make this, for instance, a very important issue. And migration is maybe also one issue, but there I don't see the cooperation with Germany. There it is with the Netherlands. So I think Austria and the Netherlands are obviously also in the frugal connection regarding monetary policy. For some reason also with some of the Baltic countries in a way in this field that also parts of the German economic policy are connected with. So there are some sorts probably of coordination, but I don't think it goes extremely deep, but that's just from outside view.
Dietmar, just a word, Monsieur l'Ambassadeur.
No, I would tend to fully agree with Mario when it comes to the nuclear policy. There is no need for any policy coordination. It's really a domestic issue. The other thing is, of course, that in view of the economic integration with the German economy, I would say there has been a period in the past where coordination, especially on economic and fiscal policy, was rather close. But I think that's no longer the case to the same extent in the last years for the reasons Mario has enumerated. So my hope would therefore be also that maybe France could discover Austria a bit more as an independent partner in some policy areas, except maybe in the nuclear field where cooperation will tend to be rather limited.
We'll do that. Madame, je vous en prie. Merci.
Hello, thank you very much for your comments. Stephanie Butzmanik from the Robert Schuman Foundation. I just wanted to react very quickly on what you said as an Austrian researcher as well. I would say the nuclear question is actually in the Austrian political identity. I would go as far as to say that. But then I was wondering how we can create this real energy union in a union where we have such diverging opinions on this very critical issue of nuclear energy, where France is very much counting on its nuclear reactors for the energy transition, for our energy independence also. And countries such as Austria, but also Germany to a certain extent, are against nuclear energy, even though that Germany is a little bit more flexible in that sense than Austria is. They have just decided to prolong the life of some of its nuclear reactors. So maybe you can answer that question of how we can come together, or can we just accept that there are differences within the member states and they're okay. We can move on like that. Thank you.
Comment at the question. Je vous en prie, Madame. Je vous en prie.
Merci.
No, it was not the two fingers. So, please press the button. We cannot hear you.
But should I maybe just comment on the nuclear first, if this is another topic? Okay. I mean, I'm very un-Austrian in the sense that I think nuclear power is not a bad thing in itself. And if you obviously compare to coal power plants and so on, and how many people die from lung cancer related to that and so on, we don't have to discuss this here. But it is, I think, also in essence true that nuclear is probably not the best option we have. And then that in fact, if we would really take it serious, that offshore wind farms are probably one of the best ideas if they are properly connected to maybe offshore wind farms in the north of Europe with proper connections to solar power in the south. I think those countries who have the most solar power generation in Europe, if I remember correctly, are for some reason Germany and the Netherlands, which is an absurd case. I mean, we should have really in the south the big solar farms and so on. And also, I mean, thinking about the costs of decommissioning nuclear power plants, I mean, this is huge. I think France is too much relying on this one source, which in the end must be also a dead end of energy policy. I mean, we will see it also with Ukraine. That is something I learned from an energy expert recently. I mean, they have extended the life of their nuclear power plants, which they mostly rely on, apart from Russian gas in their energy mix. And this comes now really to an end and it only the decommissioning of the Ukrainian power plants will cost dozens of billions of euros. And this comes on top of all the reconstruction stuff. So, I mean, this is also a cost issue. And I think one will find some ways to say, okay, this is maybe a transitional technology, but let's do really the true green energy transition. Yeah.
Well, I promise you that we will organize a debate, Franco-Austrian debate on specifically on nuclear dimension, but we did it yet.
Thank you very much. I'm a journalist. I work for the Austrian National Broadcaster. And I would like to ask you, Alice, are we actually talking about, probably this is also related to the energy question, but this transition to green technology, where are we at in Europe? Are we actually can we actually compete in this probably international race? Where are we in research and development? Did we benefit? Was Brexit probably a benefit because all these smart brains who are now a bit lost, where are they? Where are we in research and development, given that Europe is so segregated, or there is not one big brain factory? Can we actually catch up? Can we ever compete with the IRA in the European way? Do we have the brains in Europe, or are they kind of everywhere and there's no strategy behind bundling them? Can we actually compete? Thank you.
If you allow me, I'll take the remark of Maria Pata from IFRI, and then you will have the end with your concluding remarks. Maria. No.
I actually had a question relating to global gateways and to come back also to the Balkans and how to make that meet also with the environmental question, and which obviously also relates to the enlargement. Yes, I mean, is this actually an empty shell for you, the global gateways? Is this something, it was launched in September 2021, but there seems to be, there seems to be no advancement on that. And I know that Germany put forward some proposals end of last year, specifically also with regard to Serbia with a lithium mine, but also with regard to Bosnia-Herzegovina with a wind park. So are these things that come to fruition, or is this just theory for now? The goal was also of these global gateways to actually create ties and not dependency. So this is a clear positioning toward China, and criticism that was also directed toward China of countries in the Western Balkans that are increasingly indebted with regard to China. So I just wanted to know where this global gateway initiative stands.
Thank you very much. Alice, you open.
So I will give two answers, including one short and disappointing answer to you. I'm sorry, I'm not a green tech specialist. I would point you to the work of my colleagues of the Energy and Climate Center at IFRI, who work more specifically on green technology, and they will be able to fill you in about where Europe stands in terms of R&D and innovations in green tech in particular. My sense at first sight is that there's a great R&D, there's a good advancement in terms of like patent filing and the like in certain sectors, but generally we're pretty behind China in particular for EVs and solar panels and et cetera. So, but these are only some of the aspects of green techs. But again, sorry, I cannot be more precise than that. As for Global Gateway, I will only say something about the Nigeria case, which is one of the few cases where we've seen recently Global Gateway becoming real, as in the partnership package. I can't remember how it's framed, named, etc. But the author in the collective study on digital middle powers covers it in the Nigeria chapter. And at least the way this Nigerian colleague perceives it is quite successful in the way the EU is bringing together several aspects of the partnerships and support, both for startups, for research, for infrastructure, working with government standards. I mean, the fact of bundling all those different aspects, it's a good first. In terms of what I was saying earlier, is sort of a difficulty of the EU to have a real foreign policy strategy when it comes to technology. So I think it's good. And the question that I think European authorities are still having is, China has been so successful in exporting infrastructure, and not only infrastructure, but usually the software, the cameras, and also the mindset that come with it for like surveillance, for example, of citizens, which is attractive to certain governments, unfortunately. And so the EU is kind of have to ask itself, how conditional are we in our support and our aid in terms of digital? Do we want to simply counter the Chinese influence? That's it. So by exporting European technologies, or do we also try and make sure that there is also all the norms around technologies that come with it, and that we export also like a model? But I think the real answer is that it's, unfortunately, we have to change our mindset. It's not about exporting, because again, those middle powers, those recipient countries have a choice. And so they're not just passively receiving our policies. They also have leverage. They also have preferences. And so it's how do we design a development policy in technology that is not one that just tries to export in sort of a vertical fashion. And that's, I think it's really difficult to come up with sort of also promoting this bottom-up approach from partners and having a more horizontal approach, because that's what would make a difference compared to, say, for example, Chinese investment in those countries that are definitely not empowering for civil society, etc. Sorry, I took a little bit of a side answer, but yeah, I'll stop here.
Mario?
Yes, well, I think the global gateway is unfortunately, or fortunately, or whatever, one of those instances where the union is trying to repackage again things. I mean, we see it in many other areas because it just doesn't have the proper financing itself. The EU budget is just 1% of our GDP, and that's not enough. We should probably step up to 10% or something like that to really have a meaningful economic policy, and in all other fields, technology and so on. The global gateway was, I think, rather, the idea was to shift the focus a little bit on Africa. I think that was the main story about repackaging all these funds that are anyway already there and that are difficult to actually really use, and shift the focus to Africa. And I think there are a few examples. The problem is also, it just takes ages to have a project, for instance, with the involvement of the European Investment Bank. The European Investment Bank, if you speak to the people there, it is completely clear there will be no political projects with them. Each project needs a business case. Each project must be viable in itself. This is almost against the whole idea of having projects that will change reality, because it assumes that reality is the way it is, and the project has to fit into that. So it's maybe, I don't know, an urban transport thing here and there, but nothing that will have the chance to basically fail. The European Investment Bank in its portfolio, and it's very sad that we don't have the colleague here whom we could grill a little bit, but the portfolio of the European Investment Bank is completely clean. There are hardly any cases where there is a problem. But why do we need European Investment Bank where we finance only things which in principle maybe the private sector could finance as well if the business case is made perfect and everything is fine, you know. I would like to see, maybe we need a new institution, a bank that would maybe have as a target almost a certain rate of failure, because that would show that we tried also things which are at the edge, which might go wrong. And that's maybe just an indicator of the problems that we came into, that we have also a political class that just tries not to make any mistakes, just don't try something, don't try to experiment, you know. Things can go wrong. They go wrong, actually. If you do something, something will go wrong, yeah. But at least you did something, you didn't wait for things to just happen somehow. And maybe going back to also some economic history, for instance, there are colleagues who are estimating regional historical GDPs, and one colleague did it for Italy, which is an interesting case. It's in a way, I mean, the Italian state is not a very old state. It's like, it's also a very diverse country. It's almost a small European Union. And in the history of Italian regional GDP development, there is really only the 60s and 70s where the South was able to have a higher growth than the other parts of the country. And that was the period when there was really a proper industrial policy. And they made mistakes. Yes, there are some examples that were then quoted by the World Bank and everyone about the steel industry in Sicily and so on that didn't work and so on, and there was corruption and so on. But that was really the only period where the South was able to grow and have some kind of a better development. I think this is exactly this trade-off between efficiency and security, I think, that we have to talk about. And maybe we need some more bold missions. There is this mission approach also that has been discussed, but I think it's still a little bit too complicated. There is, I don't know, the proposal of Mazzucato that there is this mission about, I don't know, 20 cities with something happening there, but maybe we should really do something like, let's have, I don't know, let's find the material with which the fusion reactor works, and let's drop a dozen billion euros on research, on material research. Now I talked to this energy expert. He said, we will never find the material for the fusion reactor because it would need to stand enormous temperatures, which all our materials are not able to hold. Yeah. But okay, if we don't even try it, then we will never find out. Because if we are the first ones to find the material where the fusion reactor can be built, then the whole energy thing is done. We don't need to talk anymore about it. It's maybe it's just an illusion, but at least we could try it, I think, to find out whether it is an illusion or whether it can be made.
Merci Alice, merci Mario. I'm afraid our time is over. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for participating in this debate. As you easily realize, it's only an opening. So I hope to see you again very soon and to hear you. For those who are in Paris, bonne journée, and for the others, have a nice day. Thank you very much.